The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under the crystal chandeliers as hundreds of distinguished guests mingled during the annual charity gala. William stood near the ornate fireplace, adjusting his black tie while scanning the crowd of diplomats, celebrities, and royals who had gathered for the evening's festivities. The air buzzed with polite conversation and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Camilla glided through the crowd in her emerald silk gown, her signature pearl necklace catching the light as she moved from group to group with practiced grace. She had always been skilled at these social gatherings, knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. Tonight was particularly important as they were raising funds for children's literacy programs across the Commonwealth. William watched as his stepmother approached a cluster of journalists near the main entrance. He had learned over the years to observe her carefully during public events, noting how she could shift her demeanor depending on her audience. With the press, she was always especially charming, almost theatrical in her gestures. "Your Royal Highness?" One of the senior correspondents from the BBC greeted her with a respectful nod. "Wonderful to see you this evening. I understand you've been quite involved in organizing tonight's event." Camilla's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Oh yes, it's been such a rewarding experience. You know how passionate I am about literacy programs. I've been working closely with the education ministers from several Commonwealth nations to expand our reach." William moved slightly closer, pretending to examine the paintings on the nearby wall while listening to the conversation. Something in Camilla's tone seemed different tonight, more animated than usual. "Tell us about your recent visit to the primary school in Manchester." Another journalist chimed in, her notebook ready. "The photos showed you reading to the children. It looked like such a meaningful experience." Camilla's laugh rang out across the immediate area, causing several nearby conversations to pause momentarily. "Oh, that was absolutely delightful. The children were so eager to learn. I spent nearly 3 hours there, reading story after story. Their faces just lit up with every page we turned together." William's eyebrows furrowed slightly. He distinctly remembered that particular visit because there had been scheduling conflicts that day. Camilla had arrived late due to a previous engagement running over, and the entire visit had been compressed to accommodate her tight schedule. 3 hours? The BBC correspondent asked with interest. "That's quite generous with your time. The official schedule we received mentioned a 45-minute visit." For just a moment, Camilla's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Well, you know how it is when you're truly engaged with something meaningful. Time just flies by. I'm sure my staff adjusted the schedule accordingly." William felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had witnessed these small embellishments before. But tonight they seemed more pronounced, more deliberate. He glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed the discrepancy. "And the reading program you've developed," the female journalist continued, "we understand it's based on research you conducted personally?" "Absolutely," Camilla replied without hesitation. "I spent months studying childhood literacy development, working with educational psychologists and reading specialists. It's fascinating how different approaches can impact a child's learning trajectory." William nearly choked on his champagne. He knew for a fact that the reading program had been developed by a team of experts from Cambridge University, with Camilla's involvement limited to ceremonial endorsements and photo opportunities. The actual research and curriculum development had taken place entirely without her input. Dr. Margaret Henderson, one of the lead researchers from Cambridge who happened to be standing nearby, looked visibly uncomfortable. William caught her eye briefly and saw his own confusion reflected in her expression. "The research must have been quite intensive," the BBC correspondent pressed gently. "How long did the development process take?" "Nearly 18 months of dedicated work," Camilla responded confidently. "Late nights, weekends, constantly reviewing data and testing different methodologies. But when you're working to improve children's futures, No effort is too great. Dr. Henderson stepped forward, her academic integrity clearly at odds with what she was hearing. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said politely, "but I believe there might be some confusion about the timeline and research methodology." Camilla's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Dr. Henderson, how lovely to see you." "Yes, of course. You and your team did the technical implementation, but the foundational concept and research direction came from my extensive preliminary work." William watched as Dr. Henderson's expression shifted from polite confusion to barely contained frustration. He knew the professor well enough to recognize when she was struggling to maintain diplomatic silence in the face of academic misrepresentation. "The foundational research actually began 2 years before Your Royal Highness became involved with the project," Dr. Henderson said carefully. "The preliminary studies and theoretical framework were established through our collaboration with international literacy experts. The circle of journalists sensed tension and leaned in slightly, their professional instincts activated by the undercurrent of disagreement." Camilla's laugh became slightly more strained. "Well, of course, there was existing research to build upon, but my personal insights and hands-on experience with children really shaped the final program. I brought a unique perspective that academic research alone couldn't provide." William found himself caught between admiration for Dr. Henderson's diplomatic restraint and growing discomfort at watching Camilla dig herself deeper into a hole of her own making. He had seen this pattern before, but never so publicly, and never with such easily verifiable facts at stake. "Could you elaborate on those personal insights?" one of the younger journalists asked, clearly sensing a story developing. "My years of visiting schools and interacting directly with children gave me understanding that goes beyond theoretical knowledge," Camilla replied, her confidence seemingly restored. "I could see immediately what worked and what didn't. The children responded to me in ways that informed the entire program design." Dr. Henderson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. William realized that the professor was fighting an internal battle between her respect for the royal family and her commitment to academic honesty. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Henderson said slowly, "while your visits to schools have certainly been valuable for publicity and awareness, the program design was based on controlled studies with thousands of children across multiple demographic groups. The methodology required specific expertise in child psychology and educational research." The tension in the small group was now palpable. Other guests nearby began to notice the unusual intensity of the conversation, and William saw heads turning in their direction. Camilla's smile became more fixed. "Of course, the technical aspects required specialists, but vision and leadership are equally important. Sometimes you need someone who can see the bigger picture, who understands the real-world applications beyond laboratory settings." The real-world applications were actually tested in 12 different school systems across 3 countries, Dr. Henderson replied, her voice remaining level but her words carrying clear correction. "The pilot programs ran for 6 months before any implementation recommendations were made." William noticed that several other academics and education officials in the vicinity had begun to pay attention to the exchange. Some of them had worked directly on the literacy program and would know exactly how the research and development had actually proceeded. Professor James Mitchell from Oxford, who had been part of the International Advisory Committee, approached the group with a polite but concerned expression. "I couldn't help overhearing the discussion about the literacy program development. It's such important work." Camilla turned to him with visible relief, apparently hoping for support from another academic voice. "Professor Mitchell, yes, exactly. Such important work, and it required dedication from all of us who were truly committed to making a difference." Professor Mitchell nodded diplomatically. "Indeed. The peer review process alone took 8 months. The collaboration between Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, and the Australian National University really ensured the research met international standards." William watched as Camilla's expression flickered with uncertainty. She clearly hadn't expected the conversation to become so detailed or to attract additional expert voices. The international collaboration was essential, she agreed, though William could hear the slight hesitation in her voice. Coordinating all those different perspectives and research approaches was quite challenging. Were you involved in the coordination meetings? Professor Mitchell asked with genuine curiosity. I don't recall seeing you at the monthly video conferences we held throughout the development phase. The question hung in the air like a challenge, though it was asked with complete professional courtesy. William felt his heart rate increase as he realized they had reached a critical moment where the truth would either emerge or require increasingly elaborate fabrication. Camilla's pause lasted just a moment too long. Well, I participated in the oversight role, of course. Not every aspect of coordination required my direct presence, but I was kept informed of all major decisions and provided guidance when needed. Dr. Henderson and Professor Mitchell exchanged a look that William caught immediately. It was the kind of glance that passed between professionals who recognized they were witnessing a significant distortion of facts. The Oversight Committee included representatives from each university and the Department of Education, Professor Mitchell said slowly. The meetings were quite intensive, often lasting several hours as we worked through methodology questions and data analysis. William realized that Professor Mitchell was giving Camilla an opportunity to clarify her role without directly contradicting her, but she seemed unable to recognize the diplomatic exit being offered. Yes, exactly the kind of detailed work that requires real commitment, she responded, apparently missing the implicit correction in his statement. The circle of journalists had grown larger, and William noticed that phones were beginning to appear as reporters sensed a developing story. The ambient noise of the gala continued around them, but their small area had become a pocket of focused attention. Lady Sarah Ferguson, who had been chatting with guests nearby, approached the group with her characteristic directness. Camilla, darling, are you discussing that wonderful literacy program? I remember when you first mentioned it to me, you were so excited about supporting the researchers' work. William closed his eyes briefly, recognizing that Lady Sarah, with her good intentions but unfortunate timing, had just introduced another complication to an already strained situation. Supporting the work, yes, Camilla agreed quickly, and contributing to its development from my unique position and experience. Lady Sarah looked puzzled. Oh, I thought you said you were mainly involved in the publicity and fundraising side, which is so valuable, of course. Remember when you told me how relieved you were that the academics were handling all the complicated research parts? The silence that followed was deafening, despite the continued buzz of the larger party around them. William watched as Camilla's face cycled through several expressions, finally settling on a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dr. Henderson looked down at her shoes, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Professor Mitchell maintained his diplomatic expression, but William could see him processing the contradictions that had emerged. The journalists, meanwhile, were now fully alert to the fact that they were witnessing something unusual and potentially newsworthy. William could practically see them mentally crafting headlines and calculating the diplomatic implications of what they had heard. I think, Camilla said with forced lightness, we may be getting caught up in technical details that aren't really suitable for a social gathering. The important thing is that the program is helping children learn to read. But the damage had been done. William looked around the circle of faces and saw that everyone present understood they had witnessed something significant. The carefully constructed narrative about Camilla's involvement in the literacy program had unraveled in real time, in front of witnesses who possessed intimate knowledge of the actual facts. As if sensing the need for rescue, Charles appeared at William's shoulder, having noticed the unusual concentration of attention around his wife. Everything all right here? You all look very serious for a charity gala. His arrival created a moment of general shifting and repositioning, giving everyone a brief respite from the uncomfortable intensity that had developed. But William could see in his father's eyes that he recognized something was wrong, even if he hadn't heard the specific details of what had transpired. The evening was far from over, and William had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger unraveling. Charles surveyed the group with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades navigating royal protocol and social dynamics. His arrival had provided a momentary pause, but William could see that his father was quickly assessing the undercurrents of tension that remained palpable among the assembled guests. "We were just discussing the literacy program," Camilla said brightly, reaching for Charles's arm with what appeared to be relief. "Everyone is so interested in the research and development process." Charles nodded approvingly, unaware of the minefield his wife had just navigated. "Wonderful work, truly. Camilla has been so dedicated to this cause. I've watched her pour herself into understanding every aspect of childhood education." William felt his stomach drop further as his father unknowingly added fuel to the fire that was still smoldering beneath the surface politeness of the gathering. Dr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between her respect for the royal family and her professional obligation to accuracy. Professor Mitchell maintained his diplomatic expression, but William noticed his fingers drumming silently against his champagne glass. "Your Majesty," one of the journalists ventured carefully, "we were just learning about the development timeline for the program. It sounds like it was quite an intensive research process." "Indeed it was," Charles replied warmly. "Camilla spent countless hours with the research teams, didn't you, darling? Always coming home with stacks of papers and research reports. I'd find her at her desk late into the evening, reviewing data and making notes." William watched as Dr. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. He knew that the research team had worked primarily out of Cambridge, with most of their collaboration happening through academic channels that rarely involved direct royal participation beyond ceremonial functions. "The dedication was remarkable," Charles continued, clearly proud of his wife's involvement. "She'd often tell me about the breakthrough moments in the research, how excited she'd get when they discovered new approaches that could help struggling readers." Professor Mitchell cleared his throat gently. "The breakthrough moments were indeed exciting. The data analysis phase was particularly intensive. We had teams working around the clock to process the results from the pilot programs." "Yes, exactly," Camilla jumped in, apparently grateful for what she perceived as support. "Those late nights reviewing statistical analyses and correlation studies were exhausting, but so rewarding." William noticed Professor Mitchell's slight frown. As someone who had actually lived through those late nights of data analysis, he would know exactly who had been present and who had not. "The statistical work was quite complex," Professor Mitchell said slowly. "We had graduate students and postdoctoral researchers working in shifts to handle the computational demands. The correlation matrices alone required specialized software and expertise in multivariate analysis." "Fascinating technical work," Camilla agreed quickly. Of course, understanding the human elements behind all those numbers was equally important. Dr. Henderson finally looked up from her shoes, her academic integrity apparently reaching its breaking point. "Your Royal Highness, I wonder if we might be thinking of different phases of the project. The statistical analysis was conducted entirely by our quantitative research team using specialized protocols." Charles looked between his wife and Dr. Henderson with growing puzzlement. As someone who prided himself on understanding the details of royal engagements and charitable work, he was beginning to sense that something didn't align with his understanding of the situation. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we could clarify the timeline and specific contributions. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about such important work." William realized his father had just opened a door that would be difficult to close. The journalists were now fully focused on what had become an increasingly uncomfortable examination of facts and claims. Lady Sarah, still standing nearby, chose that moment to rejoin the conversation with her characteristic lack of filter. "Oh, Charles, remember when Camilla was telling us about how grateful she was that the universities were handling all the complicated parts? She said she was so glad she didn't have to understand all those statistical methods and research protocols." The silence that followed was so profound that William could hear conversations from other parts of the ballroom that had previously been masked by the noise of their immediate group. Charles's expression slowly shifted from confusion to concern as he began to piece together the contradictions that were emerging. His decades of experience had taught him to recognize when situations were developing beyond normal social complications. "I think," he said quietly, "there might be some miscommunication here about roles and contributions." But the journalists had caught the scent of a story, and William could see them mentally cataloging each contradiction and inconsistency. The BBC correspondent was no longer making casual notes, but was now writing steadily in his notebook. "Your Royal Highness," the female journalist addressed Camilla directly, "could you help us understand your specific role in the research process? It would be helpful for our readers to have clarity about how senior royals contribute to academic projects." Camilla's face had lost some of its color, but she maintained her smile with determination. "My role was multifaceted, as royal involvement often is. I provided oversight, guidance, real-world perspective, and coordination between different elements of the program." Professor Mitchell exchanged another look with Dr. Henderson, this one longer and more significant. William realized that they were silently debating whether to let the situation continue or to intervene more directly. "Oversight is certainly valuable," Professor Mitchell said diplomatically. "Could you elaborate on the specific guidance you provided during the methodology development phase?" The question was perfectly reasonable and professionally phrased, but William recognized it as the kind of inquiry that required detailed knowledge to answer convincingly. "Well," Camilla began, "methodology development involves ensuring that research approaches align with real-world applications and practical constraints. My experience working with children and schools provided insights that purely academic perspectives might miss." "That's a fascinating point," Dr. Henderson said, her voice carefully neutral. "Could you give us an example of a specific methodology modification that resulted from your practical insights?" William watched as Camilla's pause extended just long enough to become noticeable to everyone present. The question required the kind of specific knowledge that only someone deeply involved in the actual research process would possess. "There were several instances," Camilla replied, "where I suggested adjustments to make the research more responsive to diverse learning environments and different types of student needs." "The diversity considerations were indeed crucial," Professor Mitchell agreed. "The advisory committee spent considerable time developing protocols for different demographic groups and learning contexts. Those discussions were quite technical, involving sampling methodologies and cultural adaptation frameworks." Charles was now watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a situation that was clearly more complex than it had initially appeared. "Cultural adaptation was particularly challenging," Dr. Henderson added, "because we needed to ensure that assessment tools would be valid across different linguistic and socioeconomic contexts. The psychometric considerations alone required months of specialized consultation." William could see that his father was beginning to understand that the conversation had moved into territory where specific expertise and direct involvement would be necessary to provide meaningful input. "Psychometric considerations," Camilla repeated, her voice betraying a slight uncertainty. "Yes, ensuring that measurements were meaningful across different populations." "Exactly," Professor Mitchell said, leaning forward slightly. "The item response theory models we used required extensive calibration. Did you work directly with the psychometricians on the calibration protocols, or were you more involved in the interpretation phase? The question was delivered with perfect academic courtesy, but William recognized it as a moment of truth. Item response theory and calibration protocols were highly specialized concepts that would be familiar only to someone with deep involvement in educational research. Camilla's smile became more fixed, as she clearly struggled with terminology that was outside her actual experience. The interpretation phase was where my contributions were most valuable, helping to translate technical findings into practical applications. Dr. Henderson nodded slowly, but William could see skepticism in her expression. The interpretation phase did require bridging between statistical findings and educational practice. That work was primarily done by our team of educational psychologists who specialized in translating research into curriculum design. Collaboration between different types of expertise, Camilla said quickly. That's exactly what made the project successful. But the damage was accumulating. Each exchange made it clearer to the academic experts present that Camilla's actual involvement had been far more limited than her claims suggested. Charles stepped closer to his wife, a gesture that William recognized as protective, but which also signaled his growing awareness that something was seriously wrong. Perhaps, Charles said carefully, we should focus on the wonderful outcomes the program has achieved rather than getting too deep into the technical details. It was a diplomatic attempt to redirect the conversation, but the journalists were not ready to let go of what was clearly developing into a significant story. The outcomes are indeed important, the BBC correspondent agreed. But our readers are also interested in understanding how royal involvement in academic projects actually works. It helps them appreciate the value of supporting these initiatives. William realized that his father's attempt to defuse the situation had instead provided the journalists with a perfect justification for continuing their increasingly pointed inquiries. Lady Margaret Thornton, a prominent education advocate who had been observing from nearby, chose that moment to join the conversation. William recognized her immediately as someone who served on multiple university boards and would have intimate knowledge of how academic research actually functioned. I couldn't help overhearing the discussion about research collaboration, she said with a warm smile. It's such a complex process, isn't it? I've always been impressed by how universities manage to coordinate between so many different types of expertise. Her arrival brought another expert voice into a situation that was already strained by competing versions of reality. Lady Thornton serves on our board of advisors, Professor Mitchell said, clearly welcoming her presence. She's been instrumental in helping us navigate the intersection between academic research and public policy. The coordination challenges are enormous, Lady Thornton agreed. Just managing the communication between different research teams requires full-time project managers. I can't imagine how complex it must be when you add royal involvement to the mix. William could see that Lady Thornton's comment was intended as a polite inquiry about how royal participation actually worked. But it had the effect of highlighting the gap between claimed involvement and practical reality. Royal involvement brings unique perspectives and access, Camilla said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. It opens doors and creates opportunities for broader impact. Absolutely, Lady Thornton agreed warmly. The publicity and fundraising aspects of royal support are invaluable. I imagine the technical research teams were grateful to have that kind of institutional backing while they focused on the specialized academic work. It was perfectly phrased as a supportive comment. But William realized that Lady Thornton had essentially provided Camilla with an opportunity to clarify her actual role in terms that would be accurate and face-saving. Instead of taking the offered exit, Camilla seemed to double down. The technical teams benefited enormously from having someone who could provide strategic direction and ensure that research stayed connected to real-world needs. Lady Thornton's smile became slightly more forced. As someone who actually provided strategic direction to multiple research initiatives, she would recognize the difference between genuine strategic involvement and ceremonial support. Strategic direction in academic research is quite specialized, she said carefully. It requires deep understanding of research methodologies, funding constraints, timeline management, and publication strategies. How did you develop expertise in those areas? The question was posed with complete politeness, but William realized it was essentially asking Camilla to account for claims that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Charles was now clearly uncomfortable, though William could see he was still trying to understand exactly what was happening and why his wife appeared to be struggling with questions about work he had believed she was deeply involved in. The circle of observers had grown larger as other guests sensed the unusual intensity of the conversation. William noticed several prominent academics, journalists, and royal correspondents now paying close attention to what had become an impromptu examination of royal claims versus academic reality. The evening was about to take an even more dramatic turn. The growing circle of observers now included several individuals whose presence made the situation exponentially more complicated. Sir David Attenborough had wandered over, along with the Archbishop of Canterbury, 2 Nobel laureates, and what appeared to be half the press corps covering the evening's event. William felt as though he was watching a slow-motion disaster unfold in real time. Strategic direction, Camilla repeated Lady Thornton's phrase, buying herself time to formulate a response. It's about ensuring that academic work serves broader purposes and connects with practical applications. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a renowned educational researcher from Harvard who had been part of the international collaboration, stepped forward with a polite but determined expression. William recognized her immediately from academic conferences he had attended. Your Royal Highness, I'm Dr. Chen from Harvard. I was actually the lead coordinator for strategic planning throughout the project development. I'm curious about your perspective on how we might have improved our strategic approach. The question was delivered with perfect academic courtesy, but William understood its implications immediately. Dr. Chen was essentially asking Camilla to comment on strategic decisions that Dr. Chen herself had made in front of people who would know whether the response demonstrated genuine involvement. Camilla's pause extended several beats too long. I think the strategic approach was quite effective overall. The key was maintaining focus on outcomes that would benefit children while ensuring research quality. That's a very diplomatic response, Dr. Chen said with a slight smile. I was hoping for something more specific. For instance, do you recall our debates about whether to prioritize phonics-based interventions or whole language approaches? That strategic decision really shaped the entire research design. William felt his heart rate accelerate. Dr. Chen had just posed a question that would require detailed knowledge of educational research methodologies and specific memory of project discussions that would only be available to someone who had actually participated. The phonics versus whole language debate, Camilla said slowly, is certainly central to literacy education. Both approaches have their merits depending on individual learning styles and contexts. It was a reasonable general statement about literacy education, but William could see from Dr. Chen's expression that it didn't address the specific strategic decision-making process she had referenced. Indeed, both have merits, Dr. Chen agreed patiently. But our specific challenge was adapting our intervention design to accommodate the mixed findings from previous research. Do you remember your position on how we should weight the different approaches in our final methodology? The question was becoming increasingly specific, and William realized that Dr. Chen was systematically testing whether Camilla had any actual knowledge of the decision-making process she claimed to have guided. Charles moved closer to his wife, his protective instincts clearly activated by what he was beginning to recognize as an interrogation, albeit a polite one. Perhaps, Charles interjected, these technical details might be better discussed in a less formal setting. Academic collaboration involves so many complex decisions that it's difficult to recall specific debates without reference materials. It was a diplomatic attempt to provide his wife with an exit, but Dr. Chen's response showed that she had no intention of abandoning her line of inquiry. Of course, Your Majesty, though I should mention that this particular debate was quite memorable because it took place during a rather dramatic conference call where Your Royal Highness's input was specifically requested by the research team. William watched as Charles's expression shifted from protective concern to puzzled confusion. If such a conference call had taken place, Charles would likely have known about it, given his involvement in Camilla's official schedule and his interest in her charitable work. "Conference calls can blur together," Camilla said weakly, "especially when you're involved in multiple research projects simultaneously." Professor Mitchell stepped forward, his diplomatic restraint finally showing signs of strain. "Your Royal Highness, I believe there may be some confusion. The strategic planning calls were quite limited in number and involved very specific participants. We have detailed records of all project communications." The implication was clear. If Camilla's participation had been as significant as she claimed, there would be documentation to support it. Lady Sarah, apparently oblivious to the increasingly serious nature of the situation, chose that moment to make another well-intentioned but devastating contribution. "Oh, Camilla, you're being so modest. Remember how you told me you were relieved that you didn't have to participate in all those technical conference calls? You said the academics could handle all the complicated discussions while you focused on the public relations side." The silence that followed was so complete that William could hear his own heartbeat. Lady Sarah's comment had directly contradicted Camilla's implied participation in strategic conference calls, and had done so in front of an audience that included people with first-hand knowledge of the actual research process. Charles turned to stare at his wife with an expression that William had never seen before. It was a mixture of confusion, concern, and dawning realization that something was fundamentally wrong with the narrative he had believed about her involvement in the project. Dr. Chen's expression remained professionally neutral, but William could see that she was processing the implications of what she had just heard. The BBC correspondent was writing steadily, clearly recognizing that he was witnessing something newsworthy. "Public relations is certainly important," Dr. Chen said carefully, "but I'm still curious about the strategic input, since your involvement in decision-making was specifically mentioned in our grant applications as a key component of the project's governance structure." William felt the situation reaching a critical point. If Camilla's involvement had been cited in grant applications, there would be official documentation that could be verified independently. Grant applications often include broader descriptions of institutional support, Camilla said, but her voice lacked conviction. The specific details of individual contributions can be complex to capture in formal documents. Professor Mitchell exchanged a look with Dr. Chen that William caught immediately. As people who had actually written and submitted grant applications, they would know exactly what had been claimed and how accurately those claims reflected reality. The NSF grant specifically mentioned Your Royal Highness's role in strategic oversight and methodology review, Professor Mitchell said quietly. Those aren't typically broad descriptions of institutional support. William realized that the situation had moved beyond social embarrassment into territory that could have serious implications for both the royal family and the academic institutions involved. Charles was now clearly struggling with information that contradicted his understanding of his wife's activities. "I think," he said firmly, "we need to have a private discussion about these details before continuing this conversation in such a public setting." But the damage was accelerating beyond the possibility of private resolution. Sir David Attenborough, who had been listening with increasing interest, stepped forward with the directness that had made him a beloved public figure. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said with his characteristic gentle authority, but as someone who has worked on many collaborative projects involving royal patronage, I'm confused about the scope of involvement being described. In my experience, royal participation typically focuses on advocacy and public engagement rather than technical oversight. His observation carried enormous weight, given his decades of experience working with royal family members on various projects. It also provided an authoritative perspective on what constituted normal royal involvement in academic or scientific endeavors. "Every project is different," Camilla replied, but William could hear the strain in her voice. This particular initiative required more intensive involvement due to its complexity and importance. Sir David nodded thoughtfully. "Certainly some projects do require deeper engagement. I'm curious about the time commitment involved. Technical oversight of academic research typically requires substantial time investment and regular participation in planning meetings." It was a perfectly reasonable question, but William realized that any specific answer would be subject to verification by people who had actually participated in those planning meetings. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward with pastoral concern. "Perhaps we should consider whether this level of detailed discussion is appropriate for a social gathering. These seem like matters that might be better addressed through proper channels." His intervention carried moral authority and provided another potential exit from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. But the journalists present were clearly reluctant to abandon what had become a significant story. "With respect, Archbishop," the BBC correspondent said politely, "these are matters of public interest given the public funding involved and the claims being made about royal involvement in taxpayer-funded research." William felt the conversation shift into dangerous territory, where questions of accountability and public responsibility made private resolution increasingly difficult. Dr. Chen seemed to reach a decision point. "I think," she said clearly, "we need to be honest about what actually happened during this research project. Accuracy matters, especially when public funds and academic credibility are involved." Her statement carried the weight of someone prepared to prioritize truth over social comfort, and William realized that the moment of reckoning had arrived. "The truth," Dr. Chen continued, "is that Her Royal Highness provided valuable support through publicity, fundraising, and public advocacy. But the strategic planning, methodology development, and technical oversight were conducted entirely by academic teams with appropriate expertise." The simple, direct statement cut through all the accumulated confusion and contradiction. It provided clarity about actual roles and contributions while acknowledging genuine value in what had actually been provided. Camilla's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something between resignation and defiance. "I think there may be different perspectives on what constitutes meaningful contribution to collaborative work." But William could see that the moment for maintaining ambiguity had passed. Too many people with direct knowledge were present, and too many specific claims had been made and challenged. Charles looked at his wife with an expression that combined disappointment, concern, and what appeared to be dawning understanding of a pattern he had perhaps been unwilling to recognize before. "I think," he said quietly, "we need to conclude this conversation and address these matters appropriately." As he spoke, William found himself beginning to laugh. It started as a small chuckle that he tried to suppress, but the absurdity of the entire situation, the elaborate house of cards that had just collapsed in front of dozens of witnesses, the sheer audacity of the claims that had been made and defended, struck him as almost cosmically ridiculous. His laughter grew louder and more uncontrollable as he thought about the evening's events, the confident assertions, the mounting contradictions, the increasingly desperate attempts to maintain an unsustainable narrative, and finally the moment when reality had simply refused to be denied any longer. The sound of his laughter cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife, drawing stares from everyone present. Some looked shocked at what appeared to be inappropriate behavior given the serious nature of what had just transpired. Others seemed to understand that sometimes laughter was the only reasonable response to witnessing something so thoroughly absurd. William struggled to regain his composure, wiping tears from his eyes as his laughter gradually subsided into occasional chuckles. "I'm sorry," he said to the assembled group, "but the whole thing is just so perfectly ridiculous that I couldn't help myself." His honest response seemed to break the tension for everyone except Camilla, who was looking at him with a mixture of hurt and anger that suggested she didn't appreciate having her claims reduced to a source of amusement. But William realized that laughter was exactly what the situation required. The elaborate pretense had become so unsustainable and the gap between claims and reality so obvious that treating it as anything other than an absurd comedy would have given it more dignity than it deserved. As the crowd began to disperse and conversations resumed around them, William continued to smile at the thought that sometimes truth had a way of emerging in the most unexpected and ridiculous ways possible.